Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. The Nigerian Civil War is often introduced with statistics. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers dead, millions of civilians lost. But numbers alone cannot capture the scale of a nation tearing itself apart just 7 years after its birth. This was not merely a conflict over borders. It was a struggle for identity in a country where independence had come without unity, where decades of mistrust were pushed under a fragile political surface. At the center of the storm stood two men shaped by different histories and surrounded by incompatible visions. General Yakubu Gowon, determined to preserve Nigeria at all costs, and Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu, who believed that only secession could save his people from annihilation. Together, they would lead the largest and most catastrophic conflict in modern West African history. For Nigeria, still young and uncertain, the war was a brutal reminder that the map drawn by colonial powers did not reflect the emotional map known by the people who lived on it. Old ethnic rivalries that had existed long before the creation of the Nigerian state were suddenly thrust into the open, pushed forward by fear, ambition, and the memory of blood already spilled. The declaration of the Republic of Biafra in May 1967 was not an isolated decision. It was the climax of a tragic journey that stretched back through coups, massacres, and failed political compromises. What began as a political dispute would soon become a humanitarian nightmare broadcast to the entire world. To understand why Nigeria fractured so violently, one must step back from the smoke of the battlefield and look at the mosaic of nations Britain forced together during colonial rule. Each region, north, west, and east, carried its own history, authority structures, economic strengths, and sense of self. These differences were not just cultural, they were foundational, shaping the ways communities understood leadership, justice, faith, and destiny. In uniting them, Britain created not a nation, but an uneasy truce held together by external force. This uneasy arrangement began to unravel as soon as the colonial presence withdrew. Independence gave Nigerians the right to choose their future, but it also exposed how little they agreed on what that future should look like. The promises of national pride and sovereign identity were quickly overshadowed by old fears. Who would hold power? Who would control the new nation's wealth? Who could be trusted in a system built on suspicion rather than shared purpose? For many, particularly in the eastern region, the answer became painfully clear. Nigeria, as constructed, was not safe. By the time the first shots were fired, the conflict had already lived for years in the minds of politicians, soldiers, and ordinary people. The road to war was paved not with sudden decisions, but with slow-burning crises. Coups that destabilized the military, massacres that shattered trust, and political betrayals that proved fatal. When Biafra declared independence, it was not simply breaking away from Nigeria. It was breaking away from a system that had repeatedly failed to protect it. The tragedy is that both sides, convinced they were acting in the name of survival, marched toward the same abyss. The Nigerian Civil War would become a symbol of African vulnerability in the post-colonial era, of the dangers of artificial borders, and of how quickly hope can unravel in the absence of unity. For the world, it was an awakening. For Nigeria, it was a wound that never fully healed. And for the millions caught between the ambitions of their leaders, it was a descent into famine, displacement, and grief. This is the story of how a nation born with promise became a battlefield of broken dreams. Long before Nigeria became a single country, it existed as a landscape of distinct civilizations, each shaped by its own values, power structures, and visions of the world. The British would later fuse them into one entity, but the deep cultural borders between the Igbo, Yoruba, and Hausa Fulani had already hardened over centuries of political evolution. These societies did not simply coexist side by side. They thrived independently, rarely imagining themselves as part of a shared future. When independence arrived many generations later, the weight of these differences pressed heavily against the idea of a unified Nigeria. In the southeast, the Igbo developed societies that were unusually egalitarian for their time. Authority was not inherited through royal bloodlines, but earned through reputation, achievement, and personal merit, producing a culture that celebrated the self-made individual. This meritocratic spirit encouraged entrepreneurship, literacy, and mobility, traits that would later propel Igbos across the country as traders, professionals, and administrators. Their pursuit of opportunity was admired by some and deeply resented by others who viewed this mobility as a sign of dominance rather than industry. To the north, the Hausa Fulani world was organized in a dramatically different way. Rooted in Islamic scholarship and centuries-old emirates, their states were structured around hierarchy, obedience, and religious authority. The chain of command was clear and unquestioned, producing a stable but rigid social order. Formal Western education spread slowly here, not because of a lack of intelligence or ambition, but because it was seen as an intrusion into a long-established system that valued tradition over disruption. In the Southwest, the Yoruba built a society that blended broad philosophical traditions with a political structure centered on obas, kings whose authority was strong but moderated by councils and customs. Their culture fostered creativity, intellectualism, and a curious balance between individual expression and collective identity. Neither fully autocratic like the North, nor fully egalitarian like the East, the Yoruba occupied a middle ground that often positioned them as political pragmatists. Their diversity of religion, Christians and Muslims living side by side, added yet another layer to their complex social fabric. These differences were not minor or superficial. They defined how each group understood leadership, justice, morality, and ambition. They shaped attitudes toward governance, education, religion, and wealth, laying the groundwork for tensions that would later erupt on a national scale. When Britain arrived in the late 19th century, it encountered not one Nigeria, but a constellation of nations with little reason to see themselves as a single people. The decision to fuse them under one administrative umbrella created a unity on paper, but not in spirit. By the time the modern Nigerian state was proclaimed in 1914, the seeds of discord had already been sown. A country built from communities with opposing philosophies and unequal power dynamics was destined to struggle, especially once political competition began without the referee of colonial authority. Independence did not erase these fissures, it illuminated them. And as the young nation stepped into its new era, the weight of its fractured roots would follow it into every crisis that lay ahead. When the British arrived, they did not see Nigeria as a nation, but as a convenience, a cluster of territories to be administered efficiently and exploited economically. The empire's primary concern was not fostering unity, but reducing administrative costs, and the solution they embraced was indirect rule, a system that allowed Britain to govern through compliant traditional authorities. This system worked smoothly in the north, where established emirates already operated with rigid hierarchies, but it clashed with the decentralized, debate-oriented politics of the Igbo and complicated the mixed structures of the Yoruba. The contradictions of these arrangements laid an unstable foundation upon which a future nation would be built. In 1914, Governor Frederick Lugard executed one of the most consequential acts in African colonial history, the amalgamation of the northern and southern protectorates. British officials justified it as an administrative necessity, arguing that the wealthier South would subsidize the poorer North, but their real objective was more strategic. The North, ruled through powerful emirs, was predictable and easier to control, while the South, with its ambitious Western-educated elites, was more politically assertive. By merging the regions, Britain effectively tethered the increasingly self-confident South to the more conservative North, ensuring that the entire colony remained governable under imperial terms. The structure this created was deeply unequal. The North, with its vast population and conservative leadership, received disproportionate political weight, while the more economically dynamic South held most of the financial resources, but less political leverage. These imbalances were acceptable to Britain because they prevented any single region from rising strong enough to challenge colonial authority. But once independence became inevitable, the same structure transformed from useful tool to dangerous liability. It meant the new Nigerian state inherited not a balanced federation, but an arrangement designed for imperial maintenance, not democratic harmony. By the 1950s, the British began preparing Nigeria for self-rule, but their reforms only deepened existing divides. Regionalization strengthened ethnic identities over national unity, allowing each region to consolidate its own political parties rooted in tribal loyalty. Elections became competitions not of ideology, but ethnicity, with each bloc fighting to secure its share of influence before the British departure. As the North realized that demographic advantage would give them permanent dominance in a democratic system, they grew more invested in preserving the colonial structure that favored them. Meanwhile, the South, particularly Igbo and Yoruba intellectuals, pushed for modernization and autonomy, fearing domination by a conservative northern elite. When independence finally arrived in 1960, it did so as the culmination of compromises rather than consensus. The northern leaders agreed only because the British preserved a system in which they held numerical superiority and political primacy, while the southern leaders accepted the arrangement out of desperation to achieve sovereignty. What Nigeria inherited was not a unified state ready to chart its own destiny, but a fragile federation built on mismatched expectations and unresolved distrust. The British left a country stitched together by force, hoping it would hold. Instead, they left behind the blueprint for its eventual unraveling. When Nigeria finally approached independence, it did so under a political structure already tilted by decades of colonial engineering. The northern region, with its enormous population and cohesive political machine, was guaranteed dominance under any democratic system, while the more literate, economically vibrant South feared becoming permanently overshadowed. The negotiations leading to independence revealed this tension openly. Southern intellectuals pushed for a modern, merit-based federation, while Northern leaders insisted on preserving the colonial framework that safeguarded their authority. In the end, independence was granted not because the regions agreed, but because they accepted a compromise they could not completely trust. The first republic that emerged in 1960 was a democracy in name, but an ethnic contest in practice. Each region backed its own political party: the NPC in the north, the NCNC among the Igbo East, and the Action Group in the Yoruba West. And these parties cared more about regional interests than national cohesion. Instead of offering Nigerians shared ideals or a unified vision, the government became a negotiation table where each bloc fought for advantage. Parliament resembled a battlefield of numbers rather than ideas, with alliances formed and broken not by policy but by ethnic calculation. The imbalance built into this system was impossible to ignore. The North, with its sheer demographic weight, effectively controlled the federal government regardless of competence or performance, creating resentment among Southerners who believed they had carried the economic burden of the colony for decades. This frustration intensified as Igbo migrants, entrepreneurial and mobile, spread throughout the North, establishing successful businesses and filling civil service positions. Their visibility fueled insecurities, leading Northern leaders to adopt the Northernization policy that prioritized Northerners for employment even when better qualified Southerners applied. What began as protective regionalism soon hardened into open hostility. While political leaders quarreled, everyday Nigerians began to feel the cracks beneath their feet. Regional media stoked fear, portraying opponents as existential threats rather than political rivals. Accusations of rigged censuses, manipulated elections, and federal favoritism became common conversation, eroding public trust. Each region began to prepare not for cooperation, but for confrontation, calculating how much power it could gain or lose as the Federation strained under its own contradictions. Hope for unity faded into a climate of suspicion. The fragile republic might still have survived had its disagreements remained political, but the bitterness between regions seeped into society and the military. The colonial blueprint had created an oversized federation dependent on goodwill, yet that goodwill evaporated faster than anyone expected. Nigeria had entered independence with the world's admiration, celebrated as a rising African giant, but its foundations were never stable enough to hold the weight placed upon them. And as the political temperature rose, it became painfully clear that the promises made at independence could not prevent the storm that was gathering just ahead. The First Republic did not collapse suddenly. It decayed slowly, its foundations weakening one political crisis at a time. What was meant to be a democratic federation quickly became a battleground of regional interests, each side determined to outmaneuver the others. Corruption spread across government institutions, elections were plagued by accusations of rigging, and census results were bitterly contested because population meant political power. Instead of building a shared national identity, leaders sharpened regional loyalties until they became weapons. In the West, The Yoruba-dominated action group fractured under internal disputes and accusations of federal interference, which escalated into riots known as the Wild Wild West. Newspapers described chaotic scenes, burning homes, street militias, and rival political factions fighting openly, while federal authorities appeared either unwilling or unable to stop the violence. This instability spread uncertainty across the entire federation, convincing many Nigerians that the civilian government had lost control. As order crumbled, the public grew increasingly disillusioned with political elites who seemed too entangled in regional struggles to govern effectively. At the center, the federal coalition between the northern NPC and the eastern NCNC became a marriage of convenience, held together by fear of losing influence, not genuine partnership. Their cooperation masked, but could not resolve, the underlying rivalry between the two regions. Each decision, appointments, budgets, development plans, was scrutinized through an ethnic lens, deepening the sense that the Federation served political survival, not national progress. The military, watching from a distance, absorbed these lessons and internalized the same divisions that paralyzed the civilian government. Economic frustration added fuel to the fire. While Nigeria possessed immense potential, from agriculture to the newly discovered oil, mismanagement and regional favoritism meant that prosperity never materialized for most citizens. Igbo migrants thriving in northern cities were viewed by some northern elites as proof that their region was being overshadowed by more educated and commercially active southerners. Resentment fermented quietly in marketplaces, workplaces, and government offices, hardening attitudes and eroding the fragile spirit of coexistence. By 1965, the Republic was near paralysis, held together only by the inertia of a young state, afraid to confront its contradictions. Rumors of military intervention circulated openly, as officers whispered that only a clean sweep could rescue the country from corrupt politicians. Nigeria had entered independence with the promise of becoming Africa's beacon of democracy, yet before long it resembled a ship leaking from all sides, rudderless, divided, and drifting toward the inevitable. The sense of impending rupture grew so strong that when the coup finally came, many Nigerians welcomed it not with fear, but with relief. By early 1966, the First Republic had lost almost all credibility, and the military, once a neutral institution holding the country together, absorbed the divisions tearing the nation apart. Young officers, many of whom believed Nigeria was slipping beyond rescue, saw themselves as the last line of correction. In the early hours of January 15th, they launched a bold and violent coup, claiming they intended to purge the country of corruption and political decay. But the violence that followed would reshape Nigeria's future far more profoundly than the conspirators imagined. Led by Major Chukwuma Kaduna Nzeogwu, the plotters targeted key political and military figures, assassinating the prime minister, the northern premier, and several senior officers. Their plan was swift and ruthless, reflecting both their frustration and their idealism, an attempt to reset the nation by force. Yet not all regions were struck equally. Several prominent Igbo leaders, including President Nnamdi Azikiwe, were unharmed, and this uneven pattern would later fuel suspicions more powerful than any bullet. The coup's rhetoric emphasized national salvation, but perception quickly overshadowed intent. Because many of the coup's leaders were Igbo, and because most of its casualties were northern or western political heavyweights, the coup was interpreted in the north as an ethnic plot to seize control of Nigeria. In a nation already hypersensitive to ethnic imbalance, this interpretation spread like wildfire, igniting anger that would soon become uncontrollable. The fact that the coup ultimately failed to secure power did little to calm these fears. In the aftermath, General Johnson Aguiyi Ironsi, himself an Igbo officer, moved swiftly to restore order and prevent further bloodshed. He arrested the coup plotters but did not execute them, a decision that northern officers and civilians viewed as proof of ethnic favoritism. Ironsi's subsequent decree to abolish the federal system in favor of a unified state deepened tensions, as many northerners saw it as an attempt to centralize power under southern control. What was intended as a step toward unity instead became a spark for widespread resentment. Ironsi's government tried to steady the nation, but the damage had been done. Rumors of revenge circulated in army barracks, Northern newspapers denounced Southern domination, and civilians whispered about conspiracies in markets and mosques. The coup had shattered whatever trust remained between Nigeria's major ethnic groups, infecting both society and the military with suspicion. It was increasingly clear that the January coup had not saved Nigeria, it had destabilized it beyond measure. By mid-1966, Nigeria was no longer a fragile federation, but a nation standing on a precipice, its army split along ethnic lines, and its civilians seething with anger. What the young coup plotters had imagined as a patriotic intervention had instead become the opening act of a far greater tragedy. And in the shadows of the barracks, Northern officers prepared the next move, one that would plunge the country into an even deeper crisis. The storm that would eventually lead to Biafra was gathering force, and Nigeria was bracing for its next more violent rupture. By mid-1966, the tension inside Nigeria felt like pressure beneath a sealed drum. Everyone could sense it building, but no one knew when it would finally explode. The January coup had left the northern elite shocked, humiliated, and furious, and General Ironsi's attempts to unify the country only heightened their suspicion. In the barracks of Kaduna and Kano, young northern officers whispered about betrayal and vengeance, convinced that their slain leaders had been targeted because of their ethnicity. Each rumor, each newspaper headline, each hushed conversation added fuel to a fire now burning uncontrollably. The spark came on July 29th. In a violent counter-coup, Northern officers struck back with the same ferocity the January coup had unleashed. Ironsi, already seen as the symbol of Southern domination, was captured and murdered alongside his host, Lieutenant Colonel Adekunle Fajuyi, who refused to abandon him. The killings were brutal and symbolic, signaling the North's determination to reclaim the power they believed had been stolen. What followed was a purge within the army, with Igbo officers targeted, attacked, or driven into hiding. Out of this chaos emerged a new figure, Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon, a young northern officer perceived as more moderate, more diplomatic, and crucially, more acceptable to all regions. Gowon's appointment was not the result of a smooth transition, but a desperate attempt to stabilize a military spiraling out of control. Even so, his rise did little to calm the atmosphere. The army was no longer a single institution. It was now a mirror of Nigeria's ethnic fractures, each faction calculating its next move based on fear rather than loyalty. Outside the barracks, the streets of northern cities fell into a wave of retaliation and rage. Civilians, emboldened by the coup's success and fueled by months of suspicion, turned their anger toward Igbo migrants living among them. Marketplaces, homes, and workplaces became scenes of targeted violence as mobs attacked Igbo civilians who had nothing to do with military politics. The killings were not organized by the state, but they unfolded in plain sight, growing more vicious as rumors spread and local authorities failed to intervene. The massacres shocked the nation. Trains and lorries carried terrified Igbo families fleeing southward, describing horrific scenes of neighbors turning into attackers and communities collapsing under the weight of vengeance. For many in the East, the message was unmistakable. The Nigerian state could no longer guarantee their safety. The trust that had tied the regions together, however thin, was shattered, replaced by collective trauma that hardened into political resolve. By the end of 1966, Nigeria was no longer a country facing political instability. It was a country at war with itself in everything but name. The counter-coup had answered blood with blood, deepening the wounds the January coup had opened, and as thousands of Igbo survivors reached the East with stories of humiliation and betrayal, the question of Nigeria's survival was no longer theoretical. The nation was drifting toward a breaking point, and the next stage of the crisis would push it past the edge. The violence that swept across northern Nigeria after the July counter-coup was not a sudden eruption, but the culmination of months of anger, fear, and dangerous rhetoric. As rumors spread that Igbo officers were plotting yet another takeover, mobs turned suspicion into revenge, attacking Igbo civilians who were far removed from the political crisis unfolding in the military. Neighborhoods that had once housed mixed communities became battlegrounds where ordinary people were hunted for the ethnic group they belonged to. The killings were harrowing, merciless beatings, home invasions, and public executions that unfolded in broad daylight. railway stations and bus depots filled with desperate families clutching the few possessions they could carry. Some climbed onto trains so crowded that people hung from doors and windows, hoping only to escape before the next wave of violence found them. Survivors recounted friends disappearing into alleys, bodies left in marketplaces, and the sickening realization that local authorities were either overwhelmed or unwilling to protect them. For many Igbos, it felt as though the country they had helped build had turned against them overnight. Estimates of the dead varied widely, from 8,000 to as many as 30,000 Igbo civilians killed across the north. What mattered more than the numbers was the message, no one was safe. Every survivor carried with them not just physical injuries or lost belongings, but stories of betrayal, neighbors who joined the mobs, co-workers who looked away, and security forces who arrived too late or not at all. These experiences hardened into collective trauma that spread across the eastern region as the refugees poured in. More than 1 million Igbos fled back to their ancestral homeland, transforming towns and cities in the east into vast camps of the displaced. Schools, churches, and community halls overflowed with families sleeping on mats, many of them still in shock. Parents searched for missing children, women recounted their escapes in whispers, and the elderly stared into the distance as if replaying the moment they realized they had to run. The East absorbed these people with remarkable solidarity, but the emotional weight was too heavy to ignore. This was no longer a political crisis, it was a human disaster. As the scale of the violence became undeniable, Eastern leaders began to question whether coexistence within Nigeria was still possible. Colonel Chukwuemeka Ojukwu, the military governor of the region, visited refugees and listened to their accounts, each one reinforcing his belief that the federal government either could not or would not protect his people. He faced mounting pressure from Eastern officials, traditional leaders, and civilians who demanded more than reassurances. They wanted security, dignity, and justice. The idea of remaining in Nigeria after such horrors grew increasingly unthinkable. By late 1966, the country was trapped in a cycle of fear and mistrust that no political negotiation seemed capable of reversing. The pogroms had ruptured the fragile bond that once held the Federation together, leaving the East feeling isolated and existentially threatened. As the refugees settled into their new reality, the question hanging over everyone was stark and unavoidable. How could a nation so deeply wounded by its own divisions ever be stitched back together? It was from this climate of despair and determination that the first real calls for Eastern separation began to emerge. By early 1967, Nigeria was a nation fraying at every seam, yet both sides still clung to the faint possibility that dialogue might avert catastrophe. The pogroms had left the East traumatized and distrustful, but Ojukwu understood that outright secession carried immense risks. Gowon, for his part, faced a federation on the verge of collapse, pressured by northern officers who demanded a firm response to the January and July crises. Against this backdrop of fear and suspicion, both leaders agreed to meet in Aburi, Ghana, neutral ground far from the charged atmosphere of Nigeria's streets and barracks. Aburi became a moment suspended in time, where for the first and last time, the two sides spoke not as enemies, but as men poised on the edge of history. Ojukwu arrived meticulously prepared, armed with documents, legal precedents, and a clear strategy for regional autonomy that he believed could rebuild trust without dissolving the nation. Gowon, though initially cautious, appeared receptive, influenced by the calm environment and the moral weight of avoiding another national tragedy. For a brief moment, it seemed as though common sense and shared humanity might succeed where politics had failed. The agreement they reached was sweeping. Aburi affirmed that each region would have greater autonomy, especially over internal security and economic resources. For the East, this meant a crucial guarantee: control over its newly discovered oil, which had already become the centerpiece of Nigeria's political struggle. To Ojukwu and his advisors, the accord represented a lifeline, a chance to heal the Federation without surrendering their people's safety or prosperity. Yet the optimism of Aburi evaporated the moment Gowon returned to Lagos. Surrounded once more by the pressures of the federal establishment, military officers, civil servants, and foreign partners, especially Britain, he began to back away from the commitments he had made. Critics warned that full regional autonomy would destroy Nigeria's unity and undermine the central government's authority. Others insisted that allowing the East to control its oil revenues would leave the North economically stranded. Gowon, already governing a fragile nation, soon found himself unable or unwilling to honor the agreement. Instead, he made a decision that would alter Nigeria's destiny. Gowon announced the creation of 12 new states, a move that strategically carved the oil-rich areas out of Eastern control and placed them under the federal government. To Eastern leaders, this was nothing less than a betrayal, an unmistakable signal that the central government intended to weaken the region politically, economically, and territorially. The Aburi Accord, once a beacon of hope, had become another broken promise in a long line of disappointments. In the East, the reaction was immediate and explosive. The people who had endured pogroms, displacement, and humiliation saw the reversal of Aburi as the final proof that they could not rely on Nigeria for protection or fairness. Confidence in the Federation collapsed, replaced by a swelling determination to take control of their own fate. The idea of secession, once a painful last resort, now felt like the only road left open. Aburi could have been the turning point that saved Nigeria from war, but instead it became a symbol of what the country had lost: trust, dialogue, and the possibility of peaceful coexistence. The path ahead was set not by compromise, but by the accumulation of wounds neither side could heal. Ahead lay a declaration that would change history forever. The months following the collapse of the Aburi Accord were filled with tension so sharp it could be felt in every corner of the country. For the East, Gowon's creation of 12 states was not merely an administrative reform, it was a direct assault on their political strength and economic survival. The new boundaries carved out the oil-bearing territories and placed them under federal control, stripping the East of the wealth it relied upon to recover from the trauma of the pogroms. To many Easterners who had already lost family, homes, and dignity, this move confirmed that the Nigerian state did not see them as citizens, but as obstacles to be contained. In government offices across Enugu, Eastern officials met day after day, debating whether there was any future left within the Federation. Ojukwu listened as intellectuals, chiefs, soldiers, and refugee leaders spoke with anger that had simmered into certainty. Nigeria had become unsafe, untrustworthy, and fundamentally hostile to their existence. The stories brought by survivors of the pogroms weighed heavily on the discussions, turning political arguments into moral imperatives. Remaining in Nigeria, they insisted, was not just dangerous, it was unthinkable. Ojukwu did not rush toward secession. He understood the gravity of breaking from a nation as large and diverse as Nigeria, and he foresaw the consequences: war, suffering, and the possibility of international isolation. Yet he also saw an East filled with displaced people demanding protection, young officers demanding action, and elders demanding dignity. The choice before him was not between peace and conflict, but between submission to a federation that had repeatedly failed them and the uncertain promise of self-determination. On May 30th, 1967, after months of consultations, appeals, and rapidly unraveling trust, Ojukwu made the decision that would change the course of African history. Before a crowd of officials and citizens, he declared the independence of the eastern region under a new name, the Republic of Biafra. The announcement was met with a mixture of relief, pride, and apprehension: relief that the East had taken control of its destiny, and fear that Nigeria would not allow this decision to stand. Across the region, people poured into the streets, waving flags and embracing one another, as if reclaiming a future long denied. In Lagos, the response was immediate and unequivocal. Gowon and the federal government labeled the declaration illegal, calling it a threat to Nigeria's territorial integrity and a betrayal of national unity. To them, secession was not a plea for safety, but a challenge that could unravel the entire nation if left unchecked. The decision was made to use force if necessary, both to preserve the federation and to prevent other regions from following Biafra's lead. Within weeks, Nigerian troops were mobilized and federal aircraft prepared for action. The political standoff hardened into a military confrontation, and the shadow of war fell heavily over both nations. For the East, independence was a beacon of hope. For Nigeria, it was a red line that could not be crossed. And as both sides dug in, the question was no longer whether conflict would erupt, but how devastating it would become once it did. When Biafra declared independence, the Nigerian government moved with a speed that stunned many observers. Gowon's administration believed that allowing the East to break away would shatter the fragile federation and encourage other regions to follow suit. Federal troops were mobilized almost immediately, and within days, checkpoints, barracks, and airfields across the country hummed with activity. The government framed the coming conflict as a rescue mission to restore unity, to reassert order, and to prevent the disintegration of the state. Biafra, however, refused to fold. Ojukwu and his commanders believed that their cause, survival, dignity, and self-determination, was stronger than Nigeria's numerical advantage. They mobilized a remarkably determined army formed from regular soldiers, militia units, student volunteers, and men who had only recently fled from the north. These forces were poorly equipped but fiercely motivated, convinced that failure meant returning to the horrors they had just escaped. In the opening weeks of the war, their resolve carried them further than anyone expected. In a bold attempt to gain strategic leverage, Biafran troops launched an offensive westward into the Midwest region. Their advance was swift, capturing several towns and sending shockwaves through Lagos, which suddenly realized that the conflict would not be a quick or easy campaign. For a moment, it seemed as though Biafra might seize the initiative and reshape the war on its own terms. But this momentum masked deeper vulnerabilities: limited ammunition, insufficient logistics, and the daunting reality of fighting a nation 3 times its size. Nigeria soon regrouped and counterattacked with overwhelming force. Federal units retook lost territory and pushed deeper into Biafra, capturing key border towns and tightening pressure on the young republic. The early optimism that had accompanied Biafra's declaration of independence began to fade, replaced by the sobering recognition that the war would be long, costly, and fought on uneven terms. Every victory Nigeria claimed on the battlefield narrowed Biafra's access to supplies, trade routes, and potential allies. Foreign governments began to take notice. Britain, seeking to protect its oil interests, particularly those of Shell BP, offered strong diplomatic and material support to Nigeria. The Soviet Union, eager to gain influence in West Africa, supplied Lagos with weapons and aircraft, turning the conflict into an unlikely Cold War collaboration. Biafra, by contrast, relied on fragmented covert assistance from sympathetic African states and the quiet maneuvering of France, which saw an opportunity to challenge British dominance. The war was growing larger than its borders, shaped by the calculations of distant powers. What had begun as a political dispute was now a full-scale military conflict pulling Nigeria, Biafra, and the world into its orbit. Troops dug into trenches, civilians fled from advancing lines, and both governments hardened their positions with each passing week. The dream of a peaceful resolution evaporated, replaced by a grim reality. The war would not end through negotiation, but through exhaustion, victory, or devastation. And as the conflict deepened, Nigeria prepared to unveil a strategy that would change the nature of the war entirely. As the war dragged into its second year, Nigeria faced a sobering reality. Biafra, despite being outnumbered and undersupplied, refused to collapse. Federal advances slowed in the dense forests and swamps of the east, where Biafran fighters used their intimate knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. Every village, every inch of farmland, every narrow road became a point of resistance. Nigeria could win battles, but Biafra's spirit, fueled by survival, remained unbroken. It was then that the Gowon administration turned toward a different strategy, one not fought with bombs or bullets, but with hunger. The blockade began quietly, almost methodically. Nigerian forces closed the land borders surrounding Biafra, cut off major roads, and seized control of coastal access. Soon after, air restrictions completed the encirclement, preventing food, medicine, and supplies from reaching the region. What had once been a wartime tactic became something far more devastating, a deliberate effort to starve Biafra into submission. For the federal government, it was the nuclear option, a strategy designed to win the war without fighting endless battles. Inside Biafra, the effects spread quickly and mercilessly. Imported goods vanished from markets, farms were destroyed or abandoned, and transportation networks crumbled under bombardment. Families survived on whatever they could grow or forage: cassava leaves, wild vegetables, and occasionally smuggled rice from relief flights that risked being shot down. But as the months passed, even these meager lifelines began to disappear. Hunger stopped being a fear and became a fact of life. Children were the first to show the signs: swollen bellies from kwashiorkor, thin limbs unable to support their bodies, eyes dimming with exhaustion. These images would soon travel across the world, captured by foreign journalists who entered Biafra through clandestine routes. Their photographs, haunting, unforgettable, redefined global understanding of famine. The Biafran child became a symbol of suffering so stark that it pierced through political rhetoric and reached millions of ordinary people across continents. The world, for the first time, was forced to confront starvation as a weapon of modern warfare. Inside the Republic, hospitals overflowed with patients but lacked the supplies to treat them. Doctors performed miracles with almost nothing, sterilizing instruments over candle flames, mixing improvised nutritional pastes, and rationing medicines that should have been abundant. International humanitarian groups attempted daring nighttime flights to bring relief, but Nigerian anti-aircraft defenses made each mission a gamble. Yet those flights, however dangerous, kept Biafra alive longer than anyone predicted. Without them, the Republic might have collapsed within months. As supplies dwindled, morale fluctuated between fragile hope and numbing despair. Radio Biafra broadcast calls for resilience and unity, urging citizens to endure the blockade with dignity. But the harsh reality was unavoidable. Entire communities were wasting away. For every village that still fought, there were dozens that could no longer defend themselves, emptied not by enemy soldiers, but by hunger and disease. By late 1968, the blockade had become the most decisive factor of the war, overshadowing even the battles fought on the ground. Biafra suffered horrific losses, millions of civilians, mostly children, weakened or dead from starvation. The strategy that Nigeria believed would shorten the conflict instead prolonged it, creating a humanitarian catastrophe that shocked the world. And as the famine intensified, the war shifted again, pulling foreign powers even deeper into its orbit. As the famine deepened and the world saw images of starving Biafran children, the Nigerian Civil War ceased to be a purely domestic conflict. It became an arena where global powers maneuvered for influence, oil interests, and ideological advantage. Countries that barely knew where Biafra was on the map suddenly found themselves drawn into a war shaped not only by ethnicity, but by economics and geopolitics. Nigeria and Biafra were no longer fighting alone. They were being watched, armed, and judged by the world. Britain, Nigeria's former colonial ruler, aligned itself firmly with the federal government. London feared that a Biafran victory would weaken its economic grip on the region, especially its dominance over oil through Shell BP. British diplomats portrayed the conflict as a matter of preserving territorial integrity and preventing African balkanization. But behind the rhetoric lay a simpler truth. Nigeria, unified, was easier to manage than Nigeria broken into pieces. British weapons, advisors, and political backing poured into Lagos, giving Nigeria a decisive advantage in the war's international arena. Then came the unexpected alliance, the Soviet Union. Despite sharing no cultural, religious, or ideological bond with Nigeria's military government, the USSR saw an opportunity to challenge Western influence in West Africa. Soviet aircraft, artillery, and supplies began to arrive, making Nigeria one of the rare conflicts where Moscow and London supported the same side. For the Gowon government, this unusual partnership reinforced their belief that the war was justified both morally and strategically. For Biafra, it was yet another sign that they were fighting a giant backed by giants. Biafra, meanwhile, turned to France, not for overt military support, but for the subtle, shadowy assistance France was so adept at providing. French officials, wary of Britain's growing monopoly over Nigerian oil, encouraged Elf Aquitaine to sign deals with Biafra in anticipation of the new state's survival. Weapons were funneled through Ivory Coast and Gabon, often disguised as humanitarian shipments or routed via mercenary networks. Although France never openly endorsed secession, the quiet flow of resources kept Biafra alive during some of its darkest months. Beyond the battlefield, a war of words and images raged with equal intensity. Biafra understood early that global sympathy could be as powerful as ammunition, and they mobilized intellectuals, diplomats, and writers to frame their struggle as a fight against genocide. Among them was Chinua Achebe, whose eloquent advocacy helped transform Biafra from a regional rebellion into a symbol of oppressed peoples worldwide. Biafran spokesmen capitalized on the haunting images of starvation to galvanize international outrage, forcing global audiences to ask uncomfortable questions about Nigeria's tactics. Nigeria countered with its own narrative, insisting that the war was not ethnic persecution, but a battle against Ojukwu's personal ambition. Gowon appeared on foreign broadcasts explaining that Biafran leaders were sacrificing their own people by prolonging a hopeless war. Both sides understood the stakes. In a globalized conflict, perception shaped policy. Every photograph, every broadcast, every diplomatic statement had the power to shift international opinion, and potentially the war's outcome. By the end of 1969, the Nigerian Civil War was no longer just about territory or politics. It had become a mirror reflecting the interests of empires, old and new, a stage on which humanitarian ideals collided with the hard edges of oil economics and Cold War strategy. The support each side received was shaped not by emotion or morality, but by the calculations of distant capitals. And as these influences converged, they pushed the conflict toward a brutal and inevitable conclusion, one that would decide whether Biafra could endure another year or collapse under the weight of global forces far beyond its control. By late 1969, the war had reached a grim stalemate. Biafra was shrinking, its territory reduced to a small wedge of land surrounded on all sides by an ever-tightening Nigerian noose. Yet within that shrinking space, resistance persisted, driven by desperation, conviction, and the unshakable belief that surrender meant annihilation. The world watched a nation fighting for breath, even as its strength ebbed away with each passing day. Nigeria, sensing the moment had come to end the conflict once and for all, launched a series of decisive military operations. Among them was Operation Tailwind, commanded by Colonel Olusegun Obasanjo. This offensive cut deep into Biafra's remaining strongholds, capturing strategically vital towns and severing the last reliable supply routes. Each Nigerian advance felt like a closing door, leaving Biafran soldiers with fewer places to regroup, fewer resources to fight with, and fewer illusions about the war's trajectory. Inside Biafra, the atmosphere grew heavy with a painful mixture of determination and despair. Commanders struggled to keep their fighters supplied, often improvising weapons from scrap metal or relying on small clandestine shipments from sympathizers abroad. Civilians, already weakened by famine, fled from village to village, seeking any corner of safety as the front lines shifted. Even Radio Biafra, once the voice of defiance, began to sound fragile, its broadcasts less confident, its appeals more urgent. Ojukwu faced a reality that no leader of a besieged nation wishes to confront. The war could no longer be won militarily, and prolonging it would only multiply the suffering. His officers were exhausted, his people starving, and his diplomatic channels nearly exhausted. International relief flights continued, but each delivery felt smaller, each mission riskier. The republic he fought to build was collapsing not through a single defeat, but through 1,000 small deaths, towns lost, children lost, hope lost. In the final days of 1969, Ojukwu made a decision that reflected both courage and heartbreak. Believing that his presence had become a liability, that Nigeria would demand his head before accepting any peace deal, he fled to Ivory Coast to seek asylum and advocate for Biafra from abroad. His departure stunned many, but also cleared the path for a negotiated end. Power shifted to his deputy, Major General Philip Effiong, a calm and pragmatic figure who understood that the only remaining victory was survival. On January 12, 1970, Effiong announced Biafra's formal surrender. The next day, he met with Nigerian commanders and declared that hostilities would cease immediately. There were no triumphant parades, no celebratory fireworks, only weary soldiers laying down their arms and exhausted civilians stepping cautiously into a future filled with uncertainty. Effiong's final words carried a tone of dignity that resonated across both sides. "We are loyal Nigerian citizens. We accept the authority of the federal government." And so Biafra fell, not through the annihilation its enemies predicted, nor through the victory its supporters prayed for, but through exhaustion and unbearable human cost. The war ended quietly, in rooms filled with silence, signatures, and the weight of 3 years of tragedy. Nigeria was whole again on paper, but the wounds carved into the nation's soul would linger long after the smoke cleared. When the guns finally fell silent in January 1970, Nigeria stood at a crossroads, victorious on the battlefield but fragile in spirit. Gowon addressed the nation with the now famous declaration, "No victor, no vanquished." It was a message crafted to soothe old wounds, to signal reconciliation, and to present the federal government as magnanimous in victory. But beneath the calm rhetoric, policies and realities soon emerged that contradicted the hopeful tone of that promise. The most immediate challenge was reintegrating millions of Easterners into a country they no longer trusted. Homes had been destroyed, property seized, and businesses abandoned during the war. Yet when survivors attempted to reclaim their savings, they encountered a harsh decree that would define post-war recovery. Regardless of how much money any Igbo person had in the bank before the war, they were granted only £20. Families who once lived comfortably found themselves penniless overnight, stripped of decades of savings by a policy many believed was designed to cripple them economically. For the federal government, the justification was administrative. They argued that verifying individual claims was impossible due to destroyed records. But for the people who had endured starvation, bombardment, and displacement, the $20 policy felt like punishment disguised as bureaucracy. It robbed the Igbo middle and upper classes of the capital they needed to rebuild their lives, ensuring that their recovery would be slow, painful, and unequal. Markets that had once thrived with Igbo merchants now filled instead with traders from other regions, permanently altering economic power dynamics. At the same time, the government introduced the indigenization decree, forcing foreign companies to sell shares to Nigerian citizens. On paper, it was a nationalistic effort to transfer economic control to Nigerians, but in practice, only those with substantial capital could benefit. The Igbo, impoverished by war and stripped of their savings, could not participate. Wealthy Yoruba and Hausa Fulani elites filled the vacuum, acquiring assets and influence that reshaped the country's economic landscape for decades to come. The decree widened inequality just when unity was supposedly the national priority. Beyond economics, the social environment in the immediate post-war years was fraught with mistrust. Easterners returning to other parts of the country often found their old communities changed or hostile, uncertain whether former friends were now strangers. Some regions welcomed them cautiously, others resisted their return entirely. Even as the federal government spoke of healing, ordinary Nigerians grappled with the unspoken tensions left by 3 years of propaganda, violence, and trauma. And yet, amid these difficulties, the Igbo community displayed a remarkable resilience. With little money and even fewer resources, they rebuilt homes brick by brick, revived businesses with small loans from friends and family, and supported one another through powerful community networks. Churches, town unions, and kinship groups became lifelines, helping people restart their lives in a society still healing from division. Their determination became one of the most enduring legacies of the post-war period. But no matter how strong their spirit, the structural imbalances left by the war could not be erased through hard work alone. The political and economic decisions made in the early 1970s cemented patterns of inequality that would shape Nigeria for generations. Gowon's promise of "no victor, no vanquished" remains one of the most debated phrases in Nigerian history, both a symbol of what could have been and a reminder of what was not achieved. Though the war ended more than half a century ago, its echoes still reverberate across Nigeria. The trauma of starvation, displacement, and shattered trust did not simply disappear in 1970. They settled into the national consciousness, resurfacing whenever political tensions rise. Biafra became more than a defeated state. It became a memory carried by millions, a symbol of both suffering and the unfulfilled promise of self-determination. And like all powerful memories, it continues to shape the present. The grievances that fueled the war were never fully resolved. Centralization of power remains a defining feature of Nigerian governance, leaving many regions feeling sidelined or exploited. In the oil-rich Niger Delta, where environmental destruction and local disenfranchisement run deep, militant movements have risen and fallen in cycles of anger and negotiation. For many, The sense that the federal system benefits a small elite while marginalizing others remains as strong as it was in the 1960s. Nowhere is this more evident than in the enduring calls for Biafran revival. Groups like the Indigenous People of Biafra, IPOB, led by Nnamdi Kanu, have tapped into the lingering sense of injustice and identity among many Igbo youths. Their rallies, radio broadcasts, and online campaigns resurrect the old dream of independence, not merely as a political statement, but as an emotional response to decades of perceived marginalization. For some, Biafra is not a separatist fantasy, but a way of reclaiming dignity in a system that has never fully included them. The federal government continues to respond with a mixture of force and negotiation, unsure whether to crush the movement or address its underlying causes. Crackdowns have produced waves of arrests and sometimes violent confrontations, while political leaders issue reassurances without implementing substantial reforms. The cycle mirrors the early post-war years. Tension rises, old wounds reopen, and mistrust spreads across regions. Nigeria moves forward, but the past follows closely behind. Yet amid these challenges, Nigeria remains a nation of immense potential. Its people, diverse, resilient, and creative, have built thriving cities, cultural movements, and global diasporas that transcend the divisions inherited from colonial times. There are moments of unity, shared festivals, national victories, everyday collaborations that reveal a deeper desire for harmony. These moments suggest that despite its painful history, Nigeria's future is not predetermined by its past. Still, the legacy of Biafra endures as both a warning and a lesson. It warns of what happens when mistrust festers, when leaders prioritize power over justice, and when a nation fails to reconcile its competing identities. And it teaches that healing requires more than declarations of unity. It demands acknowledgement, reform, and empathy. Biafra's story remains unfinished not because the state still exists, but because the questions that created it remain unanswered. As Nigeria continues to navigate its complex identity, the ghost of Biafra walks beside it, a reminder of tragedy, resilience, and the fragile threads that hold a nation together. The war may have ended in 1970, but its shadow remains woven into the country's political debates, cultural expressions, and collective memory. Understanding that shadow is essential, not to reopen old wounds, but to finally close them in a way the post-war generation never could.